Well, hello everybody. And if any of you ordered a copy of the book and you have $10, come up afterwards and we'll make a trade. Okay? So we are continuing now with our investigation of human prehistory. What happened to human beings before there was any written language to write it down so that it could be read. And today I want to talk to you mainly about the migration, about how human beings spread over the whole of the earth. And I'm going to, there's going to be three sections to that, three portions. But first of all, I thought maybe we should look again at this timeline that you got last week. I made another handout in case you didn't come in time. But remember, this now has 6 timelines with old at the bottom and young at the top, and each one of them spreads out the last 10% of the one just to the left. So when we looked at this last week, we looked at the 4 columns on the left, which showed everything from 20,000 years ago, or 20 million years ago, to about 20,000 years ago. And we're going to be moving now into the time for which there is a written record. We'll be doing that mainly starting next week. But I thought it would be just interesting to look at this in terms of the big divisions of human history that David Christian has in this book. And in it, he divides human history into 3 parts. The first part is what he calls the era of foragers, or of hunter-gatherers. That's people who went out and either hunted for their food or picked whatever they could find without actually growing it and cultivating it. And that goes on for a very long time because, of course, that's what not only human beings but all of the ancestors back to 1,000 million years ago were doing. They were eating whatever they could find around. So then there's a big change that takes place about 10,000 years ago, and that's the beginning of agriculture. And so David calls that the agrarian, another word for agriculture, the agrarian epoch, in which people now start actively cultivating plants and domesticating and herding animals for food, and not only food but for other things like animals would provide muscle power and sheep's fleece and milk and things like that. So that's the agrarian era, and that starts about 10,000 years ago. So if you look at the 4th column from the left, you'll see over there at 6,000 BC, something like that, it says the Neolithic or agricultural revolution. And if you're wondering why I didn't get that exactly at 10,000 years, remember that's a very fuzzy number, because in fact agriculture began earlier in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia and Egypt, than it did in North America, than it did in Hawaii, than it did in other places. So there's a time interval there. But significantly, it comes shortly after the end of the last glaciation, which ended about 10,000 years ago. So after that point, people in different parts of the world begin at one point or another to have agriculture. And they start living in cities, and we get into what David calls the agrarian civilizations. So at the top of that 4th column, you'll see it has there the Bronze Age. There's early, middle, and late Bronze Age. And do you remember in the very first lecture of the class, I was talking to you about the Bronze Age and how the Bronze Age civilizations came to an end, apparently as the result, most likely, of warfare and of barbarian raiders who figured out how to defeat those chariot armies. So you see, remember, this 4th column goes all the way from 20,000 to the present. So that historical part is really compacted in the top portion of it. So after the Dark Age, then you have Rome, and then you have medieval times, and then you have modern times, and then that's spread out in the next column into everything for the last 2,000 years. And those last 2 columns, I just put a focus on Spain because, as you know, I'm very interested in that. And if you're going to do this time interval, you have to choose where you're going to look at because it's very different. If you were going to do the civilization of Persia or the civilization of China, you would have very different things there, because during this time interval, these last 2,000 years or more, there's been a great variety of different civilizations with different things happening in different parts of the world. I'll let you look at that fifth column at your leisure. The one on the right is a very idiosyncratic. It's not only focused on Spain, but it also happens to be focused on my family. All right? Now, there's no reason on earth why you should care about my family, but I do. And the reason I did it this way is not so that you'll remember the dates of my great-great-grandfather, but so that you'll have the idea that you can put your family onto a chart like this too, the things that count for you. And you know, at your age, I would say, while your grandparents, possibly even your great-grandparents, are still alive, maybe, hopefully, and have good memories, talk to them and find out what they remember and write it down, because you may not have a chance that will go on forever, but find out about your family and put them down here. I think you'd find it really interesting. For me, it was fascinating because I knew these dates of things that had happened in Spain, like the Peninsular War and the various Carlist Wars and the Spanish Civil War. But when I actually put down my grandfather and great-grandfather and so on back, it was fascinating to me to think which of my ancestors was alive during the Second Carlist War and that sort of thing. So I urge you to do that. Okay? So have fun with that. And now let's look at something about migrations. Okay, you'll find out about this guy. All right, so let's go back to another earlier talk in this course in which we talked about the voyages of discovery. And remember, those started in Portugal. These are the European voyages of discovery. There were Chinese voyages of discovery just slightly before this, but apparently the Chinese decided not to continue that endeavor. They stopped exploring and they sort of focused in on their own civilization. But the Iberians, first the Portuguese and then the Spanish, went and explored the whole world. And do you remember this picture? This was the authority from Aristotle, who in his book, The Meteorology, said that there were 5 climatic zones on the Earth. There was an uninhabitable northern Arctic zone, which was just too cold and icy for people to live. There was a northern temperate zone, which was inhabited by people like Greeks and Romans, Persians and people like that. Then there was the equatorial desert belt, which, according to Aristotle, was uninhabited, uninhabitable, and impassable. As you went further and further south into the Sahara, the sun would be higher and higher overhead, and if you went down in a ship, eventually the sun would set fire to the sails of your ship and it would sink and you would never come back. So nobody could live there, according to Aristotle. And then there was a southern temperate zone that maybe people might live there, although you couldn't figure out how anybody could ever get there because they couldn't get across this. And then finally there was the southern Arctic zone that was too cold. So this was the way Aristotle pictured it, probably in 300 BC, something like that. And this was authority all through the Middle Ages, and it came down. This is what the Portuguese thought their world was like until they went out and looked and explored. And so you remember then we talked about how they explored down from this Prince Henry the Navigator's base at Sagres. They explored down here, and this man here, Gilles Ayanish, managed to get past this point here, Cape Bojador, which had stopped all the previous explorers, and then they got down to here. And what they discovered, if you remember, was that the center of Africa was not uninhabitable. It was richly full of vegetation and animals, and there were people living there, lots of people. So this was the point of that lecture a couple of months ago, was that you shouldn't believe authority. You should go and look for yourself. And when they looked for themselves, they found something quite different from what they expected. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is just kind of follow the age of explorers and see what these guys found. I mean, here we said they found that the sand and the desert sand stopped and you got into rainforest. But let's look now at who they found and what. And I realize I think I have the one for your handout. So take just a tiny break while I make sure I've got the right thing here. Just a moment. Yeah, that's the wrong one. Sorry, that explains why I wasn't seeing the slides I expected to see. Okay, so let's go on now and see what these explorers found as they traveled around the world. What did they find in different places? And more specifically, who did they find there? So this picture right now shows what the medieval people living in Eurasia knew, where there was connection, if rather tenuous, from Western Europe through Western Asia, through Central Asia, all the way to China and Japan, and down into India, and all through the Arab world, and up into Russia. I mean, it wasn't like you could hop on a plane and go there, but there were people who made the journeys. You know, there were traders, merchants. So they kind of, you know, if you were a scholar and you had been interested in these things, you could have known who lived pretty much in all of this area. So then, when the Portuguese started exploring around 1400, let's see what they found. So the first place that they went to, okay, this is what they knew, and the first place they went to, and this was the Norwegians, they went to Iceland. Actually, apparently Irishmen went there a little bit before, but when the Irishmen got to Iceland, there was nobody living there, right? And that seems reasonable. It's a long way from Europe. There's a nasty sea across it. Why would anybody be living there? And nobody was, so that was sort of what they expected. Okay, where did they go next? Where did the Norwegians go after Iceland? Greenland. Was it empty? No, they went to Greenland, and it was not empty. There were people living there. Inuits or Eskimos were living there. And this is the beginning of a trend that we're going to follow for quite a while. Wherever the explorers went, there were people living there. Yeah, Deborah?
But Iceland's warmer than Greenland.
But it's also more isolated out in the middle of the sea. It's harder to get to. Iceland, she said Iceland is warmer. It's actually, the problem was that you have to sail a long way through really nasty seas to get there. So I think that's why Iceland was not inhabited before. Okay, so they got to Greenland, and there were people living there. Okay, so now I guess the Norse went over to North America, but we'll forget them for a moment, and we'll look at what the Portuguese found. So the Portuguese explored Africa, and they found people living there. And I think it was known that there were black people living south of the Sahara because, you know, there were caravan routes across here, and so there were some also in North Africa. So maybe it wasn't too much of a surprise to find that there were people living in Central Africa, but they certainly were. Okay, now where? What's the next place? Well, Columbus crossed the Atlantic for the first time and landed in the Caribbean on these islands here, and there were people living there. This is starting to be a trend, huh? It's starting to be a habit. You go someplace absolutely new and there's somebody living there, right? So they were living there, and then over the next century or two, the Spaniards explored all of the Americas, and what do you think? There were people everywhere. There were Native Americans living everywhere, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. How could that be? How did they get there? This would have blown Aristotle out of the water, wouldn't it? It would have really amazed him. Okay, so then what happens? Where's the next place? Where do you suppose the next place that got explored was? Australia, sure. So they went to Australia. And what do they find? There's people living in Australia. And where would be the next place? If you're in Australia, where do you go next? New Zealand. New Zealand. Okay, so they went to New Zealand. There are people living in New Zealand. And then they got really out where nobody could possibly be, right? Out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And when Captain Cook went there, what did he find? There's people living on Hawaii and Tahiti and all of the other islands all over the Pacific is full of people. How could this, isn't this a cool question? I mean, doesn't this just make you wonder how on earth did this happen? Even out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Where's the next place they went? Easter Island, there's people. Not only people, but statues of people. Well, finally they got to Antarctica, and at last they got to another place that was empty. So, you know, I kind of like this view of the whole trajectory of the voyages of discovery from, say, 1450 to about 1850, something like that. Starts with an empty island, then it's all populated, and finally ends up with an empty continent. But everything else has got people in it. Isn't that an amazing thing? So there's our question, and if maybe you can't read that, but it says, how did the world come to be full of people? So we're going to look at that, but before we look at the question of how people got to all of those parts of the world, what I wanted to do was to put a human face on migration, because with people having originated in Africa and ending up all the way in the Americas and Australia and Easter Island and all of these places, clearly people were moving around a lot. And there has got to be a human story behind everybody who ever migrated. So here in California, we have lots of people who came here recently from other places. Is there anybody in this room who was born in a different country and migrated here, maybe with their family? Okay. Professor Kim? How about anybody whose parents migrated here? Okay, quite a few. And undoubtedly, you've heard the stories of your parents coming to California from wherever they came from. And often it's a story of both tragedy and opportunity. I mean, it's really difficult to, in most cases, to leave the place that you were born in, that you feel like you belong, and go to someplace else. Maybe you get there and maybe things are good and maybe things aren't good. So there's always a human story, and I want to go into that. So just again, going back to my family, because I know something about it, and it will just be an example. Let me tell you about the emigration from the region of Asturias, which is the northern border of Spain. And 1 million people emigrated from this rather small region of Spain in that 100-year period from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century. And that included my great-grandfather, which is why my family's here now. So here he is, and I sure wish I'd gotten to meet him, but he died before I was born, so I didn't. I've read letters that he wrote to my grandfather, and they're absolutely fascinating. But we don't know as much about him as we wish, because he never wrote much about himself. But here is that handout I just gave you, and just to show you what the story is over here, this is this part of the last column. And over here you see the emigration of Luis Fernandez Alvarez, my great-grandfather. So he emigrated in that year, I think it was 1860. And you can see an interesting thing here. His father died the same year he emigrated, which was why he had to emigrate, because he already didn't have a mother, and he didn't have a father at that point. So he was born on a little farm in Asturias, and this is the building that he was born in, and as it was a long, long time ago. But that building is still there. Millie and I have been and visited several times with the family, and so we've been to see it. It's still there now. It's a kind of a machinery shed, but it's where he was born. And his father, the one who died there young, was a farmer, but he also had an interesting job. And we're not sure how he got the job, but he was palace manager to a prince in Madrid. This was not the crown prince, this was a secondary prince, elegant looking gentleman. But great-great-grandfather was the palace manager, so he would commute all the way from Asturias to Madrid to manage the palace. And I've often wondered, how would he be chosen? How would a farmer from hundreds of kilometers away be chosen? Only thing I can think of is that just about a kilometer up the road from his farm, there is a palace that belonged to some sort of a nobleman. And I can only imagine that the nobleman recommended great-great-grandfather to the prince, said this is a reliable guy, and he got the job. So anyhow, he would go to Madrid, and he had some sons, and the arrangement was going to be that his sons were going to go to school in the palace with the sons of the prince, who were about the same age. And that was going to be great. You know, he's going to get a great education. And I think if that had happened, he probably would have become some sort of a government functionary or bureaucrat, or maybe even a governmental administrator or something. That would have been his career. But it didn't happen because his father went off with the prince to the north of Spain on some sort of a visit or a tour, and while he was there, we don't know exactly what happened, but he either fell or was pushed off a balcony and fell and died from falling off this, balcony on the 3rd or 4th floor. And, every time I think of that, it makes me really sad, but then I think, well, if that hadn't happened, great-grandfather would have stayed in Spain. There never would have been any Spanish side of the family. I would not have existed. I wouldn't be here. But at any rate, at that point, he had to move to North America. He was only 7, but he had an older brother, and together they emigrated to Cuba. And that was possible for Spaniards in those days because Cuba was still a Spanish colony, and they could easily move to Cuba. So he migrated there. Eventually ended up in California, where he became a doctor. Then he went to Hawaii, where he was a researcher in the leper colony, and ended up in Los Angeles for the last part of his life. So that's how this one particular family emigrated to North America. But there are large numbers. 1 million people emigrated out of Asturias, and that still has a big resonance in the minds of people from there. So if you go to Asturias, you see things like this statue at the port of Gijón, of a lady bidding farewell to her children who are emigrating. And over here, there's a statue on the street of an emigrant with his luggage getting ready to get on a ship and go to usually to Cuba or Buenos Aires or someplace like that, some to Miami. But an interesting part about that is some of these people went back. Many Asturians did very well in North America, and some of them went back to Asturias once they had accumulated some money, and they built a house there. And so all over Asturias, which is not palm tree country, you see houses like this, often with a palm tree. And these are what they call casas de indianos, because in Spanish, what we would call an Indian is an indio, and an indiano is somebody who migrated to the West Indies and then often returned. So there are lots of these houses. And this is a modest one. This is somebody who did really well. And in the eastern part of Asturias, here is a Casa de Indianos, which has become the Museum of Emigration and the archive of the Indianos. And so we had a chance to go there, and it was absolutely fascinating. You got to see things about what they are trying to do to reconstruct this whole 100 years worth of people trying to figure out who they were and what they did and what their stories were. And so this man here, Santiago Romero, is the director of the museum and the archive, and he showed us around. She's a paleontologist friend of ours. And here's the sort of, the kind of, ragged luggage that people would take, and there were whole arrangements, there were whole companies that basically went around to impoverished little farms like where our family was from and recruited people to go to North America. It was a huge thing. And some of you probably have this background from Italian or for other European countries as well. And there are pictures like this one here, the ship leading off and sailing, and then just and think about the personal stories behind every one of these. So think, for example, here about this picture, which this is a famous picture in Spain of people saying goodbye to their family who are leaving, or maybe they are leaving. And so they're doing something really interesting at the archive of the Indianos. They have gone to all of the Asturian clubs all over the New World, and either been given or else copied all of the records that those clubs made. Because what would happen is, if you were an Asturian immigrant family coming from Asturias and you had arrived in Mexico City, or you'd arrived in Buenos Aires or something, there would be an Asturian club, and they would meet you at the dock, and they would take you and they'd give you a place to stay, and they would help you get started, and they kept all of these records. So all of this enormous amount of records exist, and what they're doing at the archive is they're digitizing or computerizing all of these records and looking for family ties. And it's in the process right now, but to me it's quite fascinating. What they expect eventually is to be able to reconstruct a whole 100 years worth of Asturian families, and how they were connected with each other, and who went where, and who came back a rich Indiano who could build a house, and who came back as somebody who hadn't made it and came back sort of impoverished to a worse situation. So it's going to be an absolutely fascinating historical archive. And I don't know, I would guess that this sort of thing is probably going on for other immigrant communities all over the world. So if you are from one of those families, you might look into that and see what there is. You might also, if you get interested in the background of your own family and you start compiling your family tree, well, the place is to start with your parents or your grandparents and just ask them, and you can make a family tree and find out who's on it. But then there are all sorts of resources now. Especially the Mormon Church has a very extensive genealogical resource in Salt Lake City, which you can consult. And you can find out, for example, if you had a great-great-grandfather who came from Bosnia, for example, you can find all their records from when they arrived in New York as immigrants. So all this, I think that one of the things that this whole computer digital age is making really fascinating is reconstructing all of these connections. And what will happen, maybe you dig back, Peter digs back into something from France, and maybe he can get back 4 or 5 generations through what his family knows, and then he could be online and he could discover, I'm descended from this individual, and somebody else has already done all of the work on that individual and knows all of that individual. So suddenly you just at one fell swoop, you grab a whole chunk of your ancestry, and you find out that we're descended from Marie Antoinette or something like that. And so think about doing that. It's really quite an exciting thing to do. Pardon? There's lots and lots and lots of free resources on the web about that right now. Yeah, Deborah?
You go to the Ellis Island website and you can put your relative's name in it. It'll give the travel manifesto with their name on it and
wow.
on it. And in addition, you can register the name of the person you're related to, so other people, then you will see that.
Mm-hmm.
People register names, so instantly there you've got a connection.
So this is all being reconstructed now. I would ask you, how far back do you think you might be able to go with this? How far back do you think you might be able to trace your family? Marie Antoinette, that'd be easy, 1800, that's easy. Yeah, Michelle?
Will this be restricted to, if you look up resources in the U.S., will this be restricted to back to when your first relative immigrated into the U.S.?
No, it's not restricted to when they're first immigrated. What you can do, and I don't know how this works in Asia, but in the Western Christian countries, there are birth records in parish churches. And people who get interested in this and go back to the village that their ancestor came from can often trace it back more and more and more generations just on the basis of these parish records. They'll tell who was born to whom, and then you can go to cemeteries and look at the gravestones and see all these people. Anyhow, if that appeals to you, there's all sorts of things you can do. But you probably can't go back indefinitely. I think it's unlikely that you're going to be able to trace yourself back to a third dynasty pharaoh in Egypt. And if you did, there are going to be so many boxes in your family tree that you couldn't possibly fill them all in. Okay? So now let's spend the rest of the time looking at what we do to try to get the history of humanity back before your own personal genealogy is capable of reaching. So let's do it by thinking back about what those explorers found. All over the world, everywhere they went except for Iceland and Antarctica, they found people. So how did they get there? And that would be something that as big historians we'd really like to know. So let's look into that. And here is something else. There's another resource for you if you're interested. There's a book called Deep Ancestry. It's about something called the Genographic Project. This is run by the National Geographic Society, but it's the Genographic Project. So you can easily mix those up, obviously. And this guy, Spencer Wells, is the director of this project. And what they're trying to do is to find out where everybody came from, or let me put it differently. They are interested in the migration routes by which people who, as our species began in Africa, how do we get all over the world? And how do you suppose they're doing that? That sort of can tell from the name here, can't you? Mm-hmm.
They're mapping genes.
They're mapping genes. Actually, they're using our genes as tracers for migration routes. And so this doesn't really tell about single individuals. It's now we're back far enough so we can't see individuals anymore, but we can look at migration routes of groups of people. And so that's what I want to tell you about for the rest of the time. And I'm finding this an absolutely fascinating thing, and it's a big research topic right now. If you start looking at this stuff on the web, you can find all sorts of stuff. So let me give you a little introduction to it. So let's start with genes. Okay, so many of you know more about this than I do, but at any rate, here is the huge molecule that encodes the information that makes us what we are. So this is the DNA molecule, and it is a double helix. So here's one helix going like that, and here's the other helix like that. So you can imagine just like two corkscrews intertwined. And so this thing with the reds and whites and yellows here, this is the backbone of the DNA molecule. It's represented here. This basically is a scaffold. It's if you wanted to think about it, maybe it's like a row of bookshelves in the library that are holding the information that makes us what we are. And the two intertwined corkscrews are not separate, they're connected with each other, and they're connected by a whole set of these little like lungs on a ladder going around one after another like that. And each lung on the ladder has two molecular configurations on the end which hook together real nicely. Like these will hook, but this one won't hook. So this one hooks with that one, right? And so and again, I'm sure I'm telling you stuff that almost everybody knows, but at any rate, there are 4 of these shapes on the end. You can see here are 2 that are shown as a hexagon plus a pentagon, And these are both shown as hexagons, but they have either three connectors or two connectors. These have three, these have two. So they're a little different, but the point is that A will only match up with T, and C will only match up with G. So that's what's carrying our information. It's basically a 4-letter alphabet that carries all the information that's necessary to make you. When each of us was conceived and born and developed, it was these things, this information in this DNA, that were controlling how we developed. Okay, so we all have this genetic information in us, and a lot of it changes all the time, because when two parents generate a child, most of the genetic information in that child is somehow a combination of what you get from your two parents. So, you might have the hair color of your mother and the facial features of your father, or something like that. And so that's called recombination, right? And that's mixing up these genes all the time. It isn't mixing them up in any major way, because we all have the same number of arms and legs, and there are many things in common, but it's sort of mixing up the little differences. And if something goes really wacky, then that individual probably doesn't survive. But there are a couple of cases that we'll see in a moment where the information doesn't get mixed up between the two parents in the child, and those are useful for tracking where our ancestors have moved. So here's an example. So here are two sets of information from two individuals from the same part of the same gene. So you can see if this one started, remember the 4 letters of the code are A, T, C, and G. So in this one it says A, T, G, G, A, G. This one says A, T, G, G, A, G, all the way through there. Except there's a mistake in here. Can anybody see? If this was the original one and this is the one that was copied, can you find it? I'll let you look for it while I have a little drink. Anybody see it? Well, this is mean, but I needed a drink. So let me show it to you. There it is. Now can you see it? Can you see the one that's different? So there it is marked. So here you can see, because it's overprinted, but at this point there's an A, and at this point there's a G. So what happened was then, when the how am I trying to say this? There was a mistake in copying this bit of DNA, right? So if the original one was the top one and the middle one is the descendant, that descendant carries a different letter in there. Now, if that really screws up a gene, then that individual probably doesn't survive. But there are lots of places in our genome where you can have a mistake of a letter or two, and it really doesn't make any difference. There's lots of portions that just doesn't matter. And so what will happen then is that all the other descendants of this one will have the right one, but all the descendants of this one will carry that A in there. And so there will be a whole range, a whole lineage of people descended from this individual who carry that A rather than that G. So this is great as long as you're in a situation where you don't have recombination, where your parents' genes are mixing up all the time, because then this is happening all over the place by other reasons, right? You need a mistake in a part of the genome that otherwise doesn't change. And by good fortune, there are 2 parts of the genome where recombination doesn't happen. And so here is one of them. So this is the nuclear DNA. So remember, we are eukaryotes, so we have a cell which has a nucleus, and the nucleus carries most of the DNA. But then we also have mitochondria. which carry their own DNA. So this is a chromosome. We have 23 of them across here. And so this is actually visible, I guess, with a microscope or an electron microscope. And in here, wrapped up and curled up in complex ways, are these huge long strands of DNA that carry all of our information. So all of these things recombine except for that one, which is the Y chromosome. And only males have the Y chromosome. So each male in this room got his Y chromosomes from his father, who got it from his got his grandfather and always back on the paternal lineage, and women don't have these, right? So this doesn't recombine, and if there were never a mistake in transcription anywhere, all men all over the world would have exactly the same Y chromosome. But we don't, because occasionally there's a mistake, and then it gets carried on. Okay? So that's the guy that's going to be of interest to us for understanding our patrilineal side of our heritage. Okay? Well, there's another one that works by coincidence. So this is the mitochondrion, and there's a electron microscope image, and this it's said, the caption of the image said this is actually the DNA strand itself. So in mitochondria, the DNA occurs in a circle like this, and David was telling me before class that this is the case in bacteria and archaea as well. Now the main part of our eukaryotic cells, we don't have circular DNA, but our mitochondria do, just like bacteria and archaea do. And remember, this is part of the argument that the mitochondrion is an organism that's the descendant of an organism that was sort of engulfed by the cell body. Okay, so these things do not recombine, because when the cell division takes place and when the egg and the sperm meet, the mitochondrion comes only from the mother. So this is the other case where you don't have recombination. And isn't it handy that there's one, the Y chromosome, that tracks your father's side, and then there's the mitochondrion that tracks your mother's side all the way back. So here are the tracers. So the female lineage comes through mitochondrial DNA, and this study was pioneered at Berkeley by Alan, I'm forgetting his name, Wilson, Alan Wilson, yes. And so again, mitochondria are endosymbionts, and in human reproduction, mitochondrial DNA comes from the mother's egg, not from the father's sperm. So mitochondrial DNA does not mix up more and more. It doesn't recombine. And it traces your maternal lineage. Okay, so then in a sort of a nice parallelism, there's the male lineage, and that's the Y chromosome, and that study happened to be pioneered at Stanford. And females don't have a Y chromosome. Sorry, ladies, that's not fair, but that's the way it is. However, you can find out about your father's lineage by finding out about your brother or your father or your paternal uncle, something like that. Anyhow, so in human reproduction, the Y chromosome comes from the father, not from the mother. It's a similar thing. So very neatly, out of Berkeley and Stanford, we have these two techniques. One traces your female lineage, the other traces your male lineage. And what you're looking for is cases where there has been a transcription error in there someplace that then gets carried on. It doesn't cause any damage, so it gets carried on as a sort of a neutral thing, but it's a marker for where you came from. Okay? Yeah, right. Yeah, Matt?
A couple questions.
Uh-huh.
Does that mean that if there had been any mutations, every male would have the same Y chromosome as like the first man?
I would think so. Ryan, David, you want to comment on that? Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And then also, what are the traits that are tied to the Y chromosome DNA or the mitochondrial DNA? How do those like present themselves in us?
Well, Ryan, will you feel like answering that? Get a biologist in here.
Yeah, the mitochondria generally, are the powerhouses of the cell, as they tell you in 6th grade or whatever, 8th grade. And that's exactly right. I mean, they don't do much. Like, they don't code for eye color, hair color, or a lot of things that we think of as protein functions in the body. They're really housekeeping things. So their job is to produce ATP in packets of energy and handle those. And so there are, actually I should know how many, I think it's 12 genes in mitochondria. It's maybe 20, it's a handful. And those are all ancestrally bacterial. Basically all function in producing ATP. With Y chromosomes, those are proper chromosomes, and you probably have seen sex-linked traits, things that are only apparent in males because those are traits usually that are carried on the X chromosome, have no contemporary, no pair on the Y, and so they're expressed differentially in males. There are similar things that we see as expressed differentially in females, and that those are traits that are carried on the Y chromosome, but also just kind of standard run-of-the-mill other genes are on the Y chromosome as well. It's not specialized in any real way. It is small, but yeah, it's not. There's nothing really special about it.
So the DNA of the mitochondria, could that affect your overall energy level, basically?
Yeah, and actually it ends up being a really complicated interaction between the mitochondria and the nuclear DNA, which is all the rest of the DNA, have a set of interactions that are just kind of still beginning to be understood. But it turns out that if you take a mitochondrion out of a cell and you put somebody else's mitochondrion in that cell, it doesn't work quite as well. So there are interactions, but they're indirect. So one will be making a product that gets sent to the other, and the interactions go back and forth. But it does seem like they are co-evolved. So that's a long answer for a short question.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Betty.
How does fragile
What?
How does fragile X enter into that?
How does Fragile X? Do you know about that? I don't.
That's Fragile X syndrome. It's an inherited genetic disease.
An
It travels through the
I'm sorry, I don't know anything at all about that. Do you, Michelle?
I think Fragile X syndrome is when you have like non-disjunction, when like you have too many. I forgot which one it is exactly. Where either you have too many X or too many Y chromosomes in your sort of sex chromosome set. But yeah, that's different from the tracing direct lineages. It has more to do with sort of genetic diseases, for having too many X or too many Y, where the ratio is not balanced.
Okay, good. Well, let's now go on and see how this biology gets used to understand history. So here is just sort of a summary of what we're doing. I found this rather nice diagram here. So here are your 8 great-grandparents. And what's shown down here is the circular one, that's the mitochondrial DNA, the short chromosome, that's the Y chromosome, and then these symbolize all the other chromosomes that recombine. And so now what happens in this case, see, is each of those has a child, who are your 2 grandfathers and your 2 grandmothers. So what happens here now is that in the father passes on to the son here, the blue chromosome. They're marked in color just to see who comes from who. And this one comes from the mother because that's the mitochondrion. And then in here, these are starting to mix up between this color and that color. It's a little hard to see in some of them. But each time you go down another generation, now you see these are starting to be quite mixed up. These are coming in part from each of these 4 people. So this is a variety of different colors in here. Those are the recombining chromosomes. And then here's the Y, which continues to track the male lineage. And here's the red, which continues to track the female lineage. And you come down to here, and here is you the son or you the daughter. And in both cases, your mitochondria come from great-great-grandmother down the mother's side. And the guy who has the Y chromosome gets it from his great-grandfather, and she doesn't have one. And the others are highly mixed up. So this is a sort of I like this because it really makes clear what's happening and why you can use these 2 non-combining parts of the genome to track history. Okay, so here now is a simplified tree. So I guess what I probably should have taken a moment to say, people who are interested in this sort of work, what they do is they go and they get cells from people, and usually I think it's done by just scraping the inside of your cheek. You can get cells real easily that way, and then those can be analyzed. And they look at like that long list of A's, T's, G's, and C's we had, and they look for cases where there's a difference. And obviously the computer does it for them. But every now and then they will discover an error in transcription or a gene in somebody, a chromosome or a Y chromosome or a mitochondrial DNA that has a different letter in there someplace. And that is a mutation, and that can be used to track these things. So they actually discover these different mutations, and then they give names to them. They have long, complicated names. But then you see here, the way this thing works is that this one here, this line, this is now, in this case, this is old at the top and young at the bottom. So here are all the people in a group that's called L1, and at this point there was a split, and a new character came down here, and then it continued to split, and so forth. And then each one of these, if we had a number on here, you could see what the number or the name of the different mutation is that has been discovered at some point. So all of these represent different groups of people, case of mitochondria, so this is different female lineages that have different characteristics. And one thing that shows up very clearly here is that these are the oldest ones. Oh, I should say this word haplogroup is used. David, you promised you'd tell us what a haplogroup is.
Yeah, so as you can see, this is just a normal tree that branches off. You might think about, see an analogy between this and the trees that we talked about earlier in the class that have to do with the entirety of biological development. However, in this case, the tree is only based in this particular one on mitochondria, or here's an analogous one for the Y chromosome. And because it's only based on a single chromosome, which is inherently haploid or has a single chromosome versus diploid, which is what we are. We have two chromosomes in general, so versus like a sperm and egg, which are both diploid or haploid. Sorry. This is based on a single chromosome or a single DNA sequence or a series of DNA sequences, and thus it's called the haplogroup.
Thank you. No, that's fine. So basically, you can think of it as a clade, but it's a clade that's defined on the basis of one of these mutations in either the mitochondria or the Y chromosome. Okay, so the interesting thing here is that these are the oldest mitochondrial haplogroups. You see, they go back farthest. These are more recently developed ones. In other words, these mutations that made this split or this split happened before the ones that made these last splits down here. So it's very interesting then when you go and plot these things on the map. And I guess I better explain what's going on here. Here are all of those different haplogroups that we just saw in the previous one. They're the three that we looked at, L1, 2, L3. What each one of these says is that for people, in this case, people living in the Amazon rainforest, or here Native Americans from southeastern part of the U.S. This pie diagram shows the fraction of the people, the percentage of people in that population who carry one or another of these markers. And so it's interesting then to me to see that these oldest mitochondrial haplogroups are concentrated in Africa. So this is one of the lines of evidence that our species originated in Africa and then migrated out of it. Oh yes, Louis, sorry.
Okay, so it's not only that they have the oldest ones, but I thought it was that they contain all of the tracers. All of the tracers trace back to that one of those or some of those populations. So like you can, isn't all the variation subsumed in Africa, which is why they were able to?
You know, I've seen that said, and I don't quite understand that, because the variations that give rise to these younger haplogroups they occur after, many of them occurred after people left Africa. So what you're saying, I have heard said, but I don't think I understand it. Maybe you do.
I thought
Yeah.
that all of these tracers they're all really old. But like, say, one particular one leaves, and then all that whole population is based on that one particular one.
That would be right.
Why there's like a big part of that population that has that one particular trait marker.
I think that sounds right. Yuli, were you going to say something about that?
Yeah, kind of a simple rule.
Turn around so people can hear you.
Sure. The simple rule that I've kind of learned about that regarding the mtDNA mutations have to do with the fact that the African mtDNA happens to be more diverse and more complicated than any of the other ethnic origins.
Mm-hmm.
So they really feel that most of the mtDNA had originated there and then broken off into the smaller areas as you see on the tree here. So the reason that we feel that it comes from Africa is just because of the high diversity of mtDNA, and from the different mutations over time, they've actually been able to calculate that mtDNA mutates at 13.8% per million years, I think. So it actually mutated a certain.
Yeah, she said something very important there right at the end, and that was that they assume a rate of mutation, so they kind of assume one mutation every so many tens of thousands of years. And then this has been used to try to calibrate that previous, or I'll go on to the next one because here's another one. This is the one based on Y chromosomes. You'd like to know when each of these splits took place. And so they try to do that on the basis of an assumed rate of mutation. But that's just an assumption. And it may or may not be right. Okay, thank you for those, and I'm sorry that I'm not. I think she answered it better than I did. But at any rate, so here are what the Y chromosome ones look like, and here's what they look like plotted on the Earth. And one that I'd like to show you here that I think is quite intriguing, this is the ones for Europe. So these are Y haplogroups. So I think as you look at this, you can see that these red ones are very abundant in Western Europe. And then the purple ones sort of in Central Europe, and maybe these chartreuse green ones farther over to the right. And this, and of course you need to analyze it in much more detail than this, but just from this picture, I think you can see the evidence for a conclusion. And the conclusion is that during the last glacial ice age, which was like the glacial maximum was about 20,000 years ago, that this whole area was under ice, and most of this was, and basically northern Europe was either impossible or very hard to live in. So at that time, people who had been living up there, either, well, if they didn't die off, they kind of migrated down here. At any rate, these areas in southern Europe, which was not glaciated, they're called refugia, where a refugium is a refuge where people were able to live when northern Europe was inaccessible because of the ice. And then after the ice melted, it looks like each of those populations sort of migrated back north, and that would show why you can see this purple one so dominantly all through here and the red one all through there. So there are all kinds of pieces of information that are starting to come out. This is a highly active field, and I think we're only just beginning to see the very beginning of it. I expect we're going to learn an awful lot more about the history of human migrations as work on this goes on. And here, for example, is another case, and I just pulled this out because I thought it was intriguing. I didn't fully investigate this, but in this pattern here, they're seeing these different haplogroups. And remember, this is one of these trees. And here what they've tried to do is to identify certain trees or certain haplogroups in terms of how they fit into the migration patterns of human beings. So this one says expansion of Neolithic farmers from the Near East. And this one says originating in the Paleolithic in Central Europe. spread of or Uralic speakers from the east, this post-glacial re-expansion of Paleolithic inhabitants in the west. See, that would be this one out here expanding northward after the ice. So there's all of this information, and it's carried in these enormously complicated genetic sequences that have to be analyzed, and then they have to be treated by biostatistical methods. So it's a very, very exciting field that's going on right now. So what I want to do is to show you what has been learned so far in, let's say, a tentative way about migration patterns. So here is a map based on mitochondrial DNA, and it is showing now the history of migrations based on this. And as Yuli said about this business about you assume a rate of mutation change, that's where these numbers come from in years ago, or they may also be combined with information from archaeological excavations. I'm not sure in this particular case. But the idea here is that we are African people to begin with, and that our species was confined to Africa in this region 170,000 to 130,000 years ago. And then different groups began to migrate out at certain points, beginning roughly around 70,000 years ago, something like that. And here's one long pathway running along like that, all the way out through Indonesia and into Australia. And you say, well, how did they get there across the sea? Well, remember, this is during the last ice age, and during the last ice age there was so much ice and in glaciers sitting on top of Canada and Scandinavia that sea level was about 100 meters lower than it is today. So the result was that there were large areas that you could walk around on. You could walk from India all the way through here to Australia, either without getting your feet wet or else with very short boat passages. So people were able to get all the way to Australia by something like 70,000 years ago, very rapidly. And interesting thing about this, I was just reading this morning, the point that because of sea level having been low when these migrations took place, probably these people running along here close to sea level were walking along land which is no longer land because the ice has melted, the sea level has risen. And so that the best record of this passage in human migration is probably under the shallow sea. And maybe some of you guys will be the marine archaeologists who explore it someday and find out. But you can see how all these people go to different places. It's a complicated map. Here they are at 70,000. It's odd to me. It seems like they get here really early. Well, we'll see another one that's going to show you later with more detail about that. So here they are getting to Europe 40 to 50,000 years ago, crossing to North America 12,000 to 15,000, and this is right around the last glacial maximum. So that's the time when the Bering Straits were exposed because of sea level being lower. But then, of course, they've got to get down through here, and so there's a complication. You get across the Bering Straits because sea level is low, but then you run into the glaciers on North America. So at any rate, this now is the answer to how there got to be all of those people in all of those places that the explorers visited and found to be inhabited. So here's another diagram of it. And this one, which is hard to see, in fact, I think I have a blow-up of it here. There's the Eurasian part. And which way does it go? Excuse me, go back. Can you read that? It says, that's, okay, the blue lines are traced by Y chromosome DNA, and the yellow ones that are hard to see are traced from mitochondrial DNA. But here are pathways across Eurasia, starting from Europe, starting from Africa. And I should mention this: mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. So there was a graduate student named Rebecca Kahn here at Berkeley who was working with Alan Wilson when they first started doing this work on mitochondrial DNA. And what they realized was that it looked like they could probably trace all the mitochondria back to a single woman. who lived in East Africa. She might be the mother of every single one of us. So they called her mitochondrial Eve. And then, not to be outdone, Stanford later came up with Y chromosome Adam. And it looks like they're here having a date, but in fact they existed. One of them was very much older than the other, so they weren't contemporaries at all. But now you can see these different haplogroups going out here. These would be, if you trace these, you can look on the trees, the haplogroup trees. You can see how that all goes, and then you can. Hopefully you can get the times partly out of the assumption that you know the rate of genetic change, and partly out of archaeological excavations. So all of this stuff is tying together right now, and if this story is not yet coherent, it's because it's only beginning. And I think this is going to end up being a huge field of historical research for quite a while in the future. So here they are crossing the straits of the Bering Straits and coming down into North America. And this map is coded by the gene numbers or the mutation numbers, and it could also be encoded by the times in which these things happen. This one, I found this morning. This really intrigued me. This is an early study in this, but can you see where we are? This is Afghanistan here. This is India down there. So this is the Indian Ocean. This is Africa, Persian Gulf, Arabia, like that. So this was a study of people from the Iranian Plateau and Central Asia and Pakistan and the Indus Valley, like that. And so you can, again, each one of these shows the pie diagram shows what percentage of the people in their sample carried which of these different, in this case I've forgotten whether these were mitochondrial or Y chromosome. But the really intriguing thing was here, you could see that they came from West Asian groups. So these people probably came in that way. And some came from South Asian, which means India, so came that way. East Eurasian probably means China. So there's all these mixtures, but look at that. There are some African ones, quite a few in there. And in the study, this was attributed to the slave trade. Not the slave trade we think about across the Atlantic Ocean, but the Indian Ocean slave trade. So there were people who were brought from Africa to be slaves in these places and have contributed their genes to the modern people who live there. All this information just lying there to be looked at. Okay, so I have one more thing that I want to show you in the last 10 minutes or so, and I think you'll find this really fascinating. This is an interactive map. And this was made not by the Genographic Project in Spencer Wells. This was made by a group at Oxford University led by a man named Stephen Oppenheimer. And so let me just get out of PowerPoint and go and find the other thing and show it to you, because it really brings us home, I think. Okay, hopefully I can bring this up now, and that's about right. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to travel through these different time bands. Here's a timeline across here from 150,000 years ago, 90,000, up to the present. And he has marked in here where people were at different times so that you can follow it. So let's just go through this, and I'll take it slowly so we can talk about it a little bit as we go. So we're going to start out now. So here we go, and this is where the African origins would have been. So Betty Howell's husband Clark and various people that he worked with were really responsible for finding out all of these interesting things about these very early ancestors that we had in East Africa. So that's where they start. So now let's follow it on, and I think I just go and click on the play to make this happen. Okay, so now you see as we go up towards 140,000, 135,000, you can see people migrating to other parts of Africa. And this is not just an assumption, this is based on the genetic markers that are found in people from those different parts of the world. So people who are working on this kind of thing are really especially interested in getting samples from groups of people who have lived in a particular place for a very long period of time, like these African groups. So if you in your handout, there's a web address for this. So I really urge you to go and look at it, and then take the time to go and look at all of the little links that it leads to. So as of this point, 135,000 years ago, we have people just living in Africa. This is the last interglacial. So it's a time kind of like ours, fairly warm time, and the glaciation has not yet begun, the glaciation that is going to lead to the last glacial maximum, the one just before us. But most of what happens to us then, at least what's outside of Africa, happens in the context of this last great glaciation. So let's watch that. Okay, so here we go. Oh, I missed it. Sorry. Okay, so now we're moving on towards 130,000. Can you see them moving up through the Nile Valley over into the Middle East? So what it says here, you may be too far back to read, it says 135,000 to 115,000. A group traveled across a green Sahara 125,000 years ago through the open northern gate, that would be up the Nile to the Levant. Levant is a name for the Middle East. It's basically Israel, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, places like Jordan. Anyhow, so now you've got a group up in there, and it's going to turn out that that group seems not to have survived. And there's archaeological evidence for these people, but they seem not to have left descendants. So keep your eyes on that as we go. So here we go. We're at 115,000. Now what happens? So see, they've faded out now, and they're gone. 115,000 to 90,000. The branch that reached the Levant died out by 90,000 years ago. A global freeze-up turned this area and North Africa into extreme desert. This region was later reoccupied by Neanderthal man. And as a geologist, I would want to get in there and check this out, because I'm not at all sure that global cooling corresponds to desert conditions in the Sahara. Actually, there are two different cycles running there, and so I think this may be an oversimplification. But now we're back to being just in Africa. So here, let's see what happens next. So now they're crossing the strait into Saudi Arabia, 90,000 to 85,000. So 85,000 years ago, a group crossed the mouth of the Red Sea, which he calls the Gates of Grief, which I had never heard before. That's a great name. Prior to traveling as beachcombers along the southern coast of the Arabian Peninsula towards India. Here's the Arabian Peninsula, there's India. All non-African people alive today are descended from this group. So if Oppenheimer's got it right here, every one of us in this room has an ancestor who crossed that strait in that general time of 85,000 years ago. All right, so let's go on now. So now we're moving on, and now they're beachcombing, as he said, along the shore. They probably should be just offshore, because that was a time when sea level was low. All the way around India, now over into Indonesia, down the island of Sumatra, the island of Java, up into Borneo. Some of them go up into Vietnam and up into China. So those of you who are of Chinese ancestry, that's where they got there. Okay? From Sri Lanka, it says Sri Lanka is this island here. From Sri Lanka, they continued along the Indian Ocean coast to western Indonesia, then a landmass attached to Asia because of sea level being low. Still following the coast, they moved around to Borneo and to South China. Okay, you ready to go? Any questions at this point? Let's go. Let's see what happens to them next. Travelogue here. Now, did you see what happened there? That was the super eruption of Mount Toba in Sumatra. Sumatra is this island right here, causing a 6-year nuclear winter. That's mistaken. He shouldn't say nuclear winter, because a nuclear winter is due to bombs. He should have called it a volcanic winter, but geologists are picky about those things. At any rate, causing a 6-year nuclear winter and an instant 1,000-year ice age. Notice he's got the ice up in here. So this was at this time, this would have been before the full glacial conditions. But again, I think if I were advising him, I would have given a little bit of advice on that. At any rate, what are we? A dramatic population crash to less than 10,000 adults, and volcanic ash from the eruption up to 5 meters deep. I see I'm running short of time. If you give me another 2 minutes, we'll just go through the whole thing and you can see it. So now, look at this area is depopulated because of that effect, and now it's getting repopulated from the sides. But meanwhile, people are getting into Australia, and I won't read all of it now, but we'll go on and see what happens. So now they are filling in. So India now has been repopulated. And now look, this is starting over here. This is heading in the general direction of Europe. Those are the people that are going to move into Europe. And we're at 50,000 years ago. And now people are moving through Turkey, up through Europe like that, over through France, down towards Spain. This is cold now. Say there's ice all up in here. So these people are staying in the southern areas because it's too cold in the northern part. And now continuing, it's now 40,000. He doesn't show any ice, but there probably should be. Now we've got people into Japan. We've got people into Central Asia. Keep going, and now somebody's eventually going to get into North America. Oh, there's 3 parallel tracks running there. Here people running up the Ural Mountains, and more going on over there. We've gotten into Spain now at this point. We're now at 25,000 years ago. Okay, the last glacial maximum is at 20,000 years ago. So now people have crossed here, which they could because the sea level is low. They've moved down through what's sometimes called the ice-free corridor here into eastern North America, and they're starting down the coast of British Columbia, and we're at 22,000 years ago. And now we're really at glacial maximum. So now he shows this area being cut off. These people are not in good shape. This area has now become uninhabitable. So you can't really live in England now. So this is when people were in this refugium in the Iberian Peninsula. And as we continue on now, the ice is going to start melting. Seeing how it's melting up there, and it's going to open this area up. It's going very slowly for some. Oh, I know. I see. We're seeing people now moving down into South America. They're in Colombia and Venezuela. They're coming now down in toward the Amazon. We're 15,000 years ago. We're just past the last glacial maximum. There are the great cave paintings are here. And now what happens? Oh, now they're continuing down into South America. They're in Brazil now. And moving up the Amazon, they're also coming. Ooh, California just got populated for the first time. Down the coast of Baja and across Mexico. And farther into South America. Look how recent that is. So at this point now we are, they're coming down the coast of Peru, down the coast of Chile. They're going to get all the way to Tierra del Fuego, which is really something. So now we're 12,000 years ago. We're just about the time when agriculture is going to begin. So isn't it amazing? All this stuff happens before agriculture even starts. And now we're down to 10,000, and this is where agriculture is starting. And now this area, which had been depopulated because of the ice, is now being repopulated. We're at 10,000 with agriculture starting in different parts of the world. And carrying on now, what's happening? Oh, now they can finally get up into here, Scandinavia. So Yuli, who's in Scandinavian studies, it's a brief history you're looking at there, isn't it? Okay, and carrying on. Oh, it's starting over again. So the one thing, I'll just stop it there, but the one thing that they didn't show here was the population of the Pacific Islands.